things that you need to know. And Kilnam will be familiar with most of this. I ran a conference on the digital economy at Stanford at the end of May. And these are sort of some of the broad conclusions that we came out with. So this isn't just me speaking. It's actually a group of people from around the regions, the major universities, the major companies, and people, significant people from government, talking about these things kind of off the record. And these are sort of the ideas that they came up with. And I'd be interested to get your reaction to them. Okay. This is internet governance or digital trade. We don't need governance. But what we need is a web of agreements, which we're quite familiar with doing, that manages digital trade. So, internet governance was once the purview of a group of engineers and civil society activists centered around the WSIS process and ICANN. That's a very blunt statement. I think it's true if you look back at its history. Today, the issues are no longer about network management, but rather how these new technologies are impacting on the economy and society generally. And the WSIS process and the IGF process are simply not effective institutions for dealing with them. They're not representative enough. They are not representative enough, and they're not institutionalized enough to handle those tasks. I spent a lot of time, in fact, Kilnam knows this, I ran a conference on it 2 years ago, trying to drive the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership process. Because I thought it created a framework for digital trade that was part of what I saw as a broader process for developing new baseline regulatory principles for the emerging digital economy. We need to have some baseline principles for doing it. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those principles and institutions might encompass. But if you're asking me what is the mechanism for managing these things, it's traditional trade arrangements. And we're very used to doing it. Take the model of international trade. That's the way we should be managing something that's an economy. Okay? It's not a technology. I mean, IETF and ICANN can continue to do what they're doing, but they're not at the center anymore of what is going on with respect to all these new technologies that are coming online for us. Okay. Cyber sovereignty and trade. Okay, we have a huge problem because governments are awakening to the fact that if you don't control or manage this technology, you are basically not fulfilling your responsibilities. You are undermining your authority. So their societies and economies and the way they operate on this technology called the internet are of keen interest to governments. And that's why we're seeing a lot of talk about data localization. That's why we have the Great Firewall of China. All these different types of issues are coming up as national governments are awakening to the fact that, connectivity is good, but only if we control the pipes. And certainly, as Susan outlined very well, I mean, it's become an incredible issue in the United States. Less from an economic perspective, but very much from a security perspective. How do we protect ourselves? Because we see the internet and some of the technologies associated with it as a vector for terrorism. And we're very concerned about it. And we're also concerned about the impact, perhaps, on the integrity of our infrastructure. And also, now we're beginning to worry, after this election, about the integrity of our political institutions. So, this vector provided by this platform is undermining traditional government authority. And governments are not going to sit back and let that happen. Okay? The notion that somehow the governments are going to cede authority to ICANN or to IGF or any other kind of institution, whether it's multi-stakeholder or multinational, is, I think, a fairy tale. So, there are governments and there are elements of civil society, unfortunately. I think civil society missed a huge opportunity by not getting behind TPP. I was really disappointed. There's a lot of picking and choosing of what they liked and what they didn't like. But you should have realized that this was a vector for getting more input and governance and management and more cross-the-board harmonization of rules for operating and rules and principles for operating within the digital economy. Because fundamentally, and that's why I use the word data flows, growth of the global digital economy is going to require removal of restrictions to the free flow of data. Okay? The data is really going to be the lifeblood of the digital economy, and it's absolutely essential for growth. So, I mean, cyber threats to the internet endanger the digital economy. Okay? Notice how I phrase that. Cyber threats to the internet endanger the digital economy. Okay? The internet is a crucial platform. I'm not disregarding the internet as an important component of the digital economy. I'm just saying the digital economy is much more than that. Countries are increasingly worried about the capacity to protect their networks. And of course, their economies now are very much networked. And the real challenge that we faced is that the current structure of the internet is not secure. The protocols are vulnerable, so too are the operating systems. We are operating based on good luck and bandages, okay? And I don't think IETF or ICANN or any of these existing organizations can develop that. I think actually to some extent they get in the way because people are going to have to make some decisions. And it's an open question, and this is really, I think, the danger for the younger people here in the room, as to whether we're really going to be able to migrate some of these key systems to the digital economy, whether it's financial systems, air transport. I mean, there's so much of the air transport system that is now part of the Internet of Things, and so much are controlled using internet technologies. It's a critical infrastructure, particularly if you happen to be in the air at the time something happens. And power generation to the cloud, given the multiple vulnerabilities of the current internet. AI in the digital economy. AI is kind of the joker card. It's the joker card. It's going to be a larger and larger part of the internet, of the digital economy. It's really reshaping the way we do our jobs. It's going to have a transformative impact on the legal profession. Cass, I don't know how many lawyers we're going to need. We're finding 40% at least of the job can be automated. I tell that to my daughter. She says, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll be fine." Education, I mean, the notion of universities, the notion of students sitting in classrooms, I think is going to look all so 19th century to us. Agriculture is going to be transformed, already being transformed in Japan and the United States by, not only, of course, artificial intelligence, but by the enormous computing power that is now going in to develop roadmaps for genomes and genetics and all those kinds of things. And, of course, finance and healthcare. 3D printing is, I think, just an unappreciated change. It has the potential to dramatically change the way in which we trade with each other. And it could actually become a vector for dealing with the digital divide, because you can produce anything anywhere. Now that may be pie in the sky 5 or 10 years from now. 20 years from now, I think that's going to be the norm. Yeah?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about what is artificial intelligence. Can you explain?
What is artificial intelligence? Let me throw that out to this group. What do you think artificial intelligence is?
I think you really mean machine learning here rather than
Huh?
I think you really mean machine learning here rather than AI.
Pushing?
Machine learning.
Machine learning, yes.
Rather than AI.
Okay.
So it's taking massive amounts of data and discerning patterns. And they're very simple algorithms that do this, but essentially you've got all the data coming in, and then you begin to find patterns that we don't see, but the machines are able, by looking at the data, to do. And it's problematic in many ways, because if the data is dirty, for example, if your data about criminal activity shows up in a certain way because of where you've been concentrating your police, then you can repeat patterns of racism or sexism and so on. But it also holds tremendous promise, because we use all this data to, for example, do all sorts of things. Medicine, for example. Picking up rare patterns in diseases is something you could do through AI, through this machine learning.
Yeah, that's where we are. But but there's also the issue of machine-to-machine communication, is that increasingly machines through the Internet of Things are picking up something, and they're actually either are programmed or through these algorithms where they actually learn how to respond to new situations, they're actually making decisions. And so, for example, at the simplest level, machines are monitoring the water level in a dam. And when it gets to a certain level, they're, letting the water out. They also may make decisions to contact local authorities if there's an emergency. There may be a whole lot of other things, and they're also evaluating weather from data. I mean, so there's a whole constellation of things around this whole notion of artificial intelligence. And I think Susan's explanation was exactly right. But it's a good question, because I don't think anybody really knows the parameters of this. I ran a dinner discussion, I think Kilnon may remember, on AI, and I had some key people from Google there and elsewhere that were experts on it. And I must admit, I was very dissatisfied. Nobody seems to have a real good grasp on where this thing is going. All they know is that it's coming. Okay? And so I think that one of the most dramatic, the way in which I think the quintessential technology, at least as I understand it, for the digital economy is going to be AI. And it's going to be founded, though, on props like the Internet, which provides a platform for connectivity, by things like the Internet of Things, which is billions of sensors that are feeding information to this central node, and then big data, which is correlational analysis, drawing on huge databases. IBM has taken its Watson computer and had it read every journal article on certain aspects of cancer ever written. And so as a diagnostic technique, they can feed certain information about a patient, and the computer literally can provide a diagnosis that is as good as, or sometimes even better than, the best doctor. And as more experience and more patients and other sorts of things happen, the machine is going to become better and better and better. So it's going to fundamentally change things. And hooked up with 3D printing, it's really going to change, the balance. You don't have to manufacture things at home. Things can be manufactured anywhere and sent anywhere, because it's going to simply be bits. That's what we mean by data flows. And when a car becomes a data flow, it just opens up a whole new aspect of the economy. And there it is, autos and the digital economy. Automobile is under stress. If you want to just follow what's going on with artificial intelligence and its impact on the economy, just spend every day reading about Tesla and what they're doing. And it's not just about an autonomous car. They're really transforming the industry in a way that, for example, Uber did in in undermining the licensed cab-based business model. They're reaching out directly, bypassing the traditional dealers, talking directly and selling directly to consumers. It's going to really turn things on its head. Servicing of your automobile is going to be very, very different. It's going to be an electronics problem rather than a mechanical problem. And as I said, 3D printing, IoT, which provide a continuous stream of data on automobile performance. It's not just a question of the GPS telling you where you are. There's going to be so much information going back from your car to these companies. And just think about this too. I mean, what's going to happen to the insurance industry in this particular environment, where they can dynamically adjust your insurance rates? If they noticed you went through a stop sign, suddenly you may be paying 5% more. Who knows how that's going to operate. And the real challenge to this thing is less the technology, but it's the kind of thing that I think everybody in the room here does if you've got an interest in policy. How do we put together this patchwork of national and subnational regulation in the auto area so this innovation can continue? I mean, how long is it going to take? I mean, India seems to be moving very rapidly in this area. I think the U.S. is beginning to do it, though automobile licensing is actually on a state basis. How quickly are they going to allow people to drive with their own cars? And what's going to happen to all that information that's coming from those cars? Who's going to own it? Is it my information because I'm driving the car? Or is it the company's information? Or is it the company that's collecting the information? All that. So, I mean, we're going to be overwhelmed with data. And there's a lot of issues that are going to need to be sorted out. Health. Health is completely going digital. You've got these mobile apps, that provide you with a lot of information, whether it's your heartbeat. They can send that information back to, for example, glucose levels, send them back to a hospital or to your physician. There's telemedicine, where particularly in remote areas, experts in a city-based hospital can provide expert information using a variety of tools, digital tools, to evaluate a patient. E-health, the storage of information and the ability then to use that information as a basis for developing new drugs and new therapies is going to be simply amazing. And then, digital health, AI-driven clinical diagnosis, genetic profiling. We talked about all those things earlier. And these pose huge challenges for doctors and for national health systems. How are we going to manage in this new kind of environment? So the issues now are going to become a little bit different. We're not going to be arguing about who assigns the names and numbers. That's going to seem like such a quaint little debate. Now we're going to be arguing about how our healthcare system is changing, how our transportation system is changing, how, and I'll talk about it next, how our entertainment is being delivered and parsed and evaluated. And it comes down to this: who owns all this data? Does the producer own it? Does the person who collects it own it? Does the people that are analyzing it or doing subsequent analysis on it owning it? And it's kind of interesting, and this was one of the things that came out of our discussion in May, and I hadn't really thought about it that much, but the global production of knowledge has the potential to dramatically expand the scope of the copyright industry. We thought that copyright was destroyed by the internet because it allowed the sharing of files exponentially, and the copying of books and magazines and movies. But we're now going to need new solutions based upon traceability. So a value chain is clear between the data subject, the data collector, and the user of data. And this is going to require new contracts and new terms conditioning usage. And the question is whether rights to data are exclusive or purpose and time limited. Is Google going to own your data forever? Nobody gets a copyright on a movie or a book forever. At some point in time, does Google have to turn over its information to a public domain? Who knows? We don't know right now. All these issues, but if data is the new currency, if data is the kind of new lifeblood of this digital economy, we're going to have a whole new thing about data. And so, actually, rather than wringing their hands about privacy, which I don't believe necessarily that privacy is a right. I also don't think it's a universal concept. I think it's a construct. It certainly has a strong basis in European and American constitutional and political traditions. I haven't seen privacy, and that's why I raised the question yesterday with the gentleman from Nepal, as being much of an issue or having much of an historical context here in Asia. So in some respects, it might be easier for Asians to develop what I'm going to say is rules for sharing data. And they might want to look, and this is something that came out of our conference, they might want to look at intellectual property, where you have, free and non-discriminatory terms, fair and non-discriminatory terms for sharing data. In other words, just because you own a copyright to something, for example, or own a license to a particular, for example, structure for a microprocessor, as Qualcomm does, or these companies, doesn't mean that you can refuse to license it to companies that want to use it in their products. That's what Apple and Qualcomm are arguing about right now. You have to provide that on a free and non-discriminatory basis. And indeed, competition policy increasingly is becoming based on that. So the question is, on what basis can Google or Microsoft or Tesla be compelled to share their data? And should that data also be made public, in the sense that it should become, a library function? Should I be able to go and have free access to all the data that Google has collected on India? Because I'm a student and I'm interested in doing a study on some aspect of Indian culture, and I frame my questions in ways that the kind of data that Google's been collecting from searches in India are relevant. A couple of years ago, I did do I have time to tell this story? Yeah, I think I do. A couple of years ago, I did a quick thing with my class, because I taught a three-part class between Korea, China, and Japan. And of course, you know that search, when it's language-based, is culturally determined, because search is basically related to the efficiency of delivering results that satisfy the users. Okay? And so I asked them to type in words like democracy and human rights, elections, and I wanted to see if the results were same in Japan and Korea and Japan and China. And what do you think was the result? They were vastly different. Vastly different. Now, part of that is an artifact of the fact that the databases in Chinese language, Japanese language, and Korean language are constructed differently. And also, of course, the results that satisfy users, that bump up to the top, are different. But it does tell you that the data is really, at the moment it's universal, it is also becoming increasingly fragmented. Okay? And so there's a lot of interesting things that are related to how data is going to be handled that are quite outside the privacy debate. I frankly think the privacy debate is a sideshow. I don't believe that people have necessarily an inalienable right to privacy, whether it's constitutionally or morally determined. And I think it can be handled generally in terms of contracts and other kinds of commercial arrangements. Certainly going to have to be with Tesla, and all of you are used to doing that because you sign contracts with Facebook and Google and everybody else on the internet that provides you with some kind of service. So I'm going to, competition policy is going to change. I don't know how many people are even remotely interested in competition policy. Wow, Kelly. I think competition policy, far more important than privacy, far more important than intellectual property, far more important than security. Why? Because it's related to dominance. And all of those issues at the end of the day are related to dominance. And how do you regulate that? Because you've got a tension between the fact that the internet is about scale, and scale benefits the consumer. And you got an issue there with respect to what services are really free, and to what extent can you regulate a consumer interest in getting stuff for free, and how do you value free? So we have a whole set of competition rules that were developed for the analog economy, and they're just not ready to come up to the speed of the digital economy. The key questions include definition of the market, the value of the data, the pricing of services. How do you regulate future technologies? And what I would say is that current competition policy, if you guys want to work on something, that would be, to me, the absolute key item to work on. Because I said everything is derivative of it. Work on competition policy and try to figure out what kind of balance needs to be struck in that particular area. And I would say that the big thing you got to think about is the tension between ex ante, where you're prescribing a set of rules that companies need to follow, and ex post, where you're basically allowing companies to develop different kinds of business models, deploy different kinds of technologies, offer different kinds of services to consumers, develop different sort of relationships to consumers. And when there's a problem, when there's an actual problem, whether it's a monetary problem or a problem that touches on notions of fairness or safety of individuals, then you come in and regulate it. And you regulate it very, very specifically. And I would argue that should be the case for certainly for the healthcare, but also for a wide variety of other areas. So I said that trade policy should be kind of a mechanism or a model for thinking about this. So what would a digital trade policy look like for the Asia Pacific? First, non-discrimination clause for cross-border delivery of digital services. Localization just doesn't make sense. Never will and shouldn't. We need to have agreement around principles and dispute settlement mechanisms for supporting a trusted digital environment in the region. I mean, you shouldn't depend upon Google to solve your problems if there's an issue. We need somehow or other to have an authority that goes beyond national regulatory bodies, whether it's nestled in APEC or the EU or some other regional organization, or perhaps a global, though that's hard to consider at this moment, that allows people to feel that if they have an issue, it's going to be dealt with, and it'll be dealt with in a way. And companies need to understand that unless they have the trust of their consumers, and people talked about this before, that's important. We do need to have a consensus on regulatory principles and guidelines for safeguarding cyberspace and infrastructure. That's where cyberspace comes in. But the fact is, we can deal with that in the context of a trade arrangement or in kind of a security relationship that basically is focused on protecting e-commerce, broadly defined. And e-commerce includes health, it includes transportation, a whole variety of things. We need to have that. If we don't have that again, and countries are involved with targeting, collecting information, doing a variety of different things, we need to understand that. We need to come up with some common sense rules, bearing in mind what Susan said, it's always going to happen. And if you think you're going to eliminate that aspect of behavior, it'll be difficult. But, along the area of chemical weapons and nuclear weapons and other sorts of things, we can come up with common sense kind of regulations at kind of a broad level that allow this kind of digital global revolution to continue. And then I think in trying to get sector-specific certification bodies that provide standards of conduct. In other words, not just having nationally based systems, but for example, now under the APEC privacy rules, we're beginning to develop bodies that are certifying companies that they operate in ways consistent with the interests of consumers and the broad interests of the business. So I think certification bodies can offer us a way of getting there. I'd just like to finish up with two quick things, and then I'll open up to questions for the last 15 minutes. China and the digital economy. Out here in Asia, there's really, I think, two big issues that we need to think about. It's not possible to think about the digital economy in Asia without looking at China. And I don't see any Chinese here. Am I wrong?
There are Chinese.
Okay. I would say we need, in terms of your proportion of the economy, probably half of the people in the room should be Chinese. And that's something that needs to be worked on. Because the period of internal growth and development in China is drawing to an end, and Chinese companies, the Alibabas, the Tencents, the Baidus, the Huaweis and others, are going to be exploding into Asian markets. They're going to ride the cloud, and it's going to happen first here in Asia, and then it's going to happen globally. And China, I think, I think you heard from Hong Shu, who is here, is developing into a very sophisticated digital economy, but they're going to have to make adjustments in their approaches to intellectual property and to privacy, as well as cooperation with each other on cybersecurity. If China is not ready to move in these areas for internal political reasons, they're going to fail economically, and they're going to be a huge drag on the development of the digital economy in the region. And so we all have a collective interest in working on those issues. That's what you guys should be working on, is trying to find ways to get China more into this dialogue and taking more responsibility for IP and privacy. And remember I said that IP rules increasingly can deal with privacy concerns, because I see it as a commercial transaction. And we need to be sure that and Chinese companies need to come up with assurances that data and other sorts of information that are shared are going to be treated appropriately. And finally, I think that countries and companies are very concerned about the security of Chinese devices and services. So they're going to have to win trust, and project the image and reality of accountability. Okay? If you've got a commercial dispute, if you're concerned about the security of a Chinese device, that's going to be a huge liability as they move into these markets. And to turn your heads and just say, well, Huawei is cheap, we're going to put it in all our systems, that is a huge, huge, huge mistake. If you can't trust Cisco, let me tell you, wait till you see when Huawei is running a lot of your infrastructure. Okay? So those kind of, those are part of a growth thing. I'm optimistic, and frankly, over the last 3 or 4 years as I've been working with Chinese colleagues, there's an internal debate. I think there's also an increasing recognition of the need to participate in the external debate within China. And so I think that China can do that, but that's something to work on, not abstract discussions about ICANN and other sorts of things. And then, people don't talk a lot about Indonesia. I had a chance to visit Indonesia last October, incredibly impressed with all the things that are going on there. It's a big market, distinctive and proud culture, and it's really kind of gone its own way in developing the internet. And they're very proud of the fact that their mandates on data localization has helped to spur a lot of growth among their companies. And I think for a period of time, I mean, they've got a huge population, they've got economic potential. Indonesia can do that. They're big enough. I mean, why was China so successful on the internet? Because they're as big as the internet. Okay? Population does matter. Scale does matter. I think Japan is finding the limits of that. Korea knew about the limits from the beginning. That's why their industry and their regulatory framework is much more outward looking. But I think for the future of Indonesia, and I think it's a good test case, and it's again, you need to have more people from Indonesia in here talking about these kinds of issues. You know, my good friend Yudo needs to come here and lecture us, because I love to debate with him. If you're building a competitive internal market, but to move to the next level, you're going to have to be integrated into global markets. And with the cloud, big data, IoT, and AI, Indonesian companies are going to have to learn how to access international infrastructure and get the expertise of global partners if they're really going to participate in the digital economy. It's for a period of time now, I think we'll still see that China and Indonesia can develop self-sufficiency in a digital economy because they're big enough. But ultimately, they're going to have to be part of the broader system. And what I would argue, as the biggest countries, along with India here in the region, they're the ones who should be showing the leadership. And again, I'm glad that there are a good number of people here from India. I'm disappointed that none of my Japanese colleagues can find the energy to come here. I know Jiro was here earlier. But I think if this school is going to be successful, it really needs to, recruit and bring in people that are tied in to this digital economy. Unfortunately, I don't think civil society is enough. I'll be very blunt about that. But I'm going to stop now, and you guys can come after me. Okay? Thank you.